So yeah, as I was saying, the Trent and Mersey Canal, the trustees of the Weaver Navigation really didn't want it open because they knew that they would lose a lot of their business from the river onto the canal. And when it did open, they did in fact start losing quite a bit of business. Now all the pottery trade that used to come along the river went onto the canal, including the flint and clay that came back the other way. And the other main things that they lost was a lot of the salt industry, because when they built the canal, they built it through the towns of Sandbach, Middlewich and Marsden, which are salt producing towns. So the salt that used to come onto the river went onto the canal. But the canal, it's 9 miles from here to the end of the canal, which is at a place called Preston Brook. And then from there it joins the Duke of Bridgewater's canal and goes from there further 3 miles to Runcorn. Only a few hundred yards from where the Weaver Navigation finishes. So it's 12 miles to Runcorn on the river and 12 miles to Runcorn on the canal. So why would you need to put a boat lift here? It's a bit crazy really, because it all goes to the same place. So you think all the goods have got to Runcorn along the river or the canal, we don't need to move in between the two. But it was all because of time and money. Now when they built the Trent and Mersey Canal, it was one of the first proper canals in the country. And there's 3 things between here and Preston Brook that used to slow them down. Man-made things. Has anybody got an idea what they are? No? Oh, I'll tell you. They're tunnels. And these tunnels were the very first substantial tunnels in the country. Ready? Ooh.
He's only been doing it 12 years. I think that's the first time he's got it without bumping. Oh, well done, well done. I come in like a pinball when I'm steering, just because I can. Especially when you be sideways on it.
Yeah, so these tunnels were the very first substantial tunnels in the country. First substantial canal tunnels, sorry. And when they built them, they hadn't got the design quite right. They were only wide enough for one narrowboat. There was no towpath through them. So they used to have to untie the horses, walk the horses over the top and get them to wait on the other side. So how do you think they managed to get the boats through these tunnels? Legging it. Do you know, show me with your hands how you think they did it. So you'd only get 1 point for that. Really, yeah, truly, because these were the first tunnels in the country. They were scared that they'd collapse, so they built them oval shaped. So if you lay on the roof of your boat, you sort of had wheel spin, your legs wouldn't touch the ceiling, especially if you're vertically challenged like I am. So what they used to have to do was lay a plank across the front of the boat and have 2 people legging them through sideways. Now this is Barnton Tunnel, this was a reproduction in the 1960s, and this is Barnton Tunnel. It's about a mile away. There you go, sir. Andrew knows the sons of one of these people. Yeah. And it was quite time consuming. Now there's around about 2,000 yards of tunnel, or 1.25 miles of tunnel. So how long, if you think, right, a horse-drawn narrowboat, it's a bit of a trick question this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. A horse-drawn narrowboat travels about 2 miles an hour, and it's 12 miles to Runcorn. So how long do you think you would allow to get your boat to Runcorn? Sorry? No, some people think 6 hours, 12 miles, 2 miles an hour. But they used to allow 2 to 3 days because of these tunnels, because they were bottlenecks. And also the extra person that they would need, they had to hire to help them leg these boats through the tunnel. Some of these people were some of the poorest people in the country, and they couldn't even afford shoes. So they used to wrap their feet in cloth. And this was where the word tow rag comes from. Used a bit of a derogatory term now, but back in the day, they used to hire tow rags to help them leg the boats through the tunnels. So you'd have to pay them. But once you got to Runcorn, you then had the problem of getting your boat 100 feet down onto the Mersey estuary at low tide. So you'd have to take your boat down through 10 locks. Once you was on the Mersey estuary, you couldn't get your boat to Liverpool because they were horse-drawn and horses can't walk on water. Even today you wouldn't really want to take a narrowboat across the lumpy water of the Mersey estuary. So they used to have to unload them into sailboats as big as this, sail them across to Liverpool, unload them again onto the sailing ships and sail them off around the world. This could take as much as a week. That's an awful amount of time. But the same journey on the Weaver Navigation, loaded onto a sailing ship like this, could be in Liverpool and being unloaded in under 8 hours. So once the trustees of the Weaver Navigation realised this, they bought this land here at Anderton, just so that they could try and steal trade from the Trent and Mersey Canal. And they only bought it here because this is the closest place between the canal and the river. And what they did to get the boats even closer, they dug a channel out from where the marquee is, up along underneath the children's playground. It turned the corner, went behind this brick house here, and went halfway into the basin. And to get the goods from the top to the bottom, one of the main goods was the salt. They used to unload it into a big cart, push it across the towpath along a wooden trestle, and then tip it down into the holds of the waiting boats below. There's a photograph on the wall here of a salt chute at the side of Anderton Boat Lift. It's about 1906 photograph, and it shows you where the salt used to load directly into the boats below. That was a great way of getting rid of the salt. Mr. Wedgwood's pottery though didn't go too well down a salt chute. So what they used to have to do with that was unload it, put it on a cart which was on railway tracks, lower it down the hill, and this was interconnected to one at the bottom. So the one at the top would get loaded with the heavy pottery, and that would lower it down the rail, and it would pull a lighter one up to the top, ready to go again. And it proved so successful that this became one of the busiest inland ports in the country. It was really, really popular. And then it started creating its own problems. You were getting bits of bottlenecks. You might have to wait a couple of days to get your boat unloaded. But it was still quicker than going via the canal to Runcorn. So to alleviate it, they dug out the basin that we just came in. And as we go up, if you look at the wall, you can see a clear join in the wall where the old channel finished and the basin started. Just so that they could get more salt chutes and more inclines in, and have a bit of a one-way system with the boats where they could go in one side and out the other, rather than have to try and reverse them all out, just to try and speed this process up. And it worked well, but it got busier and busier and busier. Now, it worked well up until one of the engineers who was employed to turn the navigation into what it could become now, a gentleman called Edward Leader Williams. He turned round to the trustees and said, well, if we can get boats from the top to the bottom, we will be able to unload the boats side by side, just starting to move, bounce up. He said it would be much quicker and easier and cheaper to unload them side by side. So first off, they were going to put a series of locks in here, so which you thought like they've done all around the canal network. But because it's such a short distance, we would have had to have a set of staircase locks like they did in Leeds or Bingley. But fortunately, we don't have a hillside like the Pennines like they do up there. And also it uses a lot of water, so that was soon discarded. Another idea was putting an inclined plane with tanks on it like this one that we're in, on railway tracks, and lower these boats down the hill on railway tracks. They did this in Leicestershire, a place called Foxton. But you need two parallel waterways, but on the bend of the canal or on the bend of the river. So they soon discarded that idea. And Edward Leader Williams had seen boat lifts done before. So this wasn't the first, but these were big stone structures. But hydraulics was like electric is now, that was the big thing of the day. And he thought, well, if I can get a hydraulic boat lift here, it would solve all our problems. He wasn't a hydraulic engineer, so he went knocking on the door of a gentleman called Edwin Clark, who came up with the design. That's who this boat's named after. The original lift is still here. If you look down at the sides, you can see that the runners at the caissons are running up a column. There's three columns, one on this side, one in the middle, and one on the other side. Same at this end, there's the three columns, one at that side, one in the middle, and one at the side. And they're just to guide these caissons up and down. You put the other column, which is this one that you see at the front, at the very front, just to triangulate it. And where this walkway is, that was the top of the old lift. It just had a trellis work. And his design was really, really simple. This is a tank of water sitting on a giant ram which is below us. These are like big pistons and these are interconnected. And the brick house that you saw behind us, that used to have a steam engine. So what they used to do first thing in the morning, like then as per now, these caissons are at the bottom, but they used to fire the steam engine up, get a head of steam up, pressurise the hydraulic fluid. This was stored in what was called an accumulator, just a big piston really with the weight on it. So as the pressure built up, it pushed this piston up and the weight just kept it under pressure. Once it was up to pressure, they opened the valve and the very first caisson of the day used to slowly rise to the top. It used to take about 30 minutes. Once it was at the top, they used to open the gates, bring 2 narrowboats into the top caisson, load 2 narrowboats in the bottom caisson. Now thanks to Archimedes, he discovered water displacement. So this caisson full of water weighs 252 tonnes. This boat weighs 34 tonnes. We'll call it 250 and 30. If we come in here, what does this caisson weigh? Anyone have any ideas?
It's still 250.
Exactly. This gentleman's got it. It's still the same because Archimedes discovered water displacement. So when we come in here, we displace our own weight of water. So when the gate closes, it still weighs exactly the same. So if you've got boats in the bottom, one and one at the top, these weigh 252 tonnes each. Now if you was to open a valve between the two, the one at the top will start coming down and the one at the bottom will start coming up. And they'd get halfway. They'd just stop there because they would be completely balanced. And this is where his design is quite nice. If you look in the centre of the boats on either side, you'll see some holes in the caisson. And what there used to be, there's 7 of them dotted around the caisson. And what they used to do was use an accumulator, raise the one at the bottom out of the water by 6 inches. Yeah, it just bounces, it's just normal.
Is it there?
No, it is, it's bouncing, yeah, it's just the new seals, they're just bedding in still. Yeah, it was exactly the same when it opened 20 years ago, we just replaced the seals on it. But these holes, what they used to do was raise the lower caisson 6 inches and siphon out 6 inches of water. This would make the lower caisson 15 tonnes lighter than the top caisson. So now when they open the valve, the top one being 252 tonnes, will push the one at the bottom weighing 237 tonnes, pretty much all the way to the top. And what was said to be by the boat people at the time, a terrifying 3 minutes. Now if you think about it, in 1875, the only people that had experienced vertical travel were miners that used to go down in the mines. There was no lifts or anything like that really. So to be stood on the back of a boat in a tank of water being raised 50 feet into the air in 3 minutes was pretty much the Alton Towers ride of its day. But it worked well, they soon got used to it. But this was Edwin Clark's very first boat lift, so it was his prototype, so he made a few mistakes. One of the mistakes he made was using the hydraulic fluid he used was this stuff, good old Trent and Mersey Canal water. Now they've been tipping salt into this for 100 years, loading the narrowboats up. And canals do actually flow downhill through the locks, and all the salt producing towns are uphill. If it had been the other way, it might have been different. So the water that they was using the hydraulic fluid was salty. Now salt and cast iron doesn't mix too well, so it started corroding the rams and it was grooving them. So to fix it, what he decided to do was they chiselled out the rust and they hammered it a soft metal, annealed it, filed it smooth, make the seals good again. But that was another mistake. The metal he used was copper. Now copper and cast iron are 2 dissimilar metals, and when you put them in salt water, it actually makes a 50-foot tall battery. So we have 2 50-foot tall batteries here, and they were getting electrolytic corrosion. So the rams were actually corroding quicker than if they'd done nothing at all. So it was a real shame. They went over to see the chemist at Brummond and they said, why is our rams rusting away? They said, well, don't use this stuff. You need to run it on distilled water. So they fitted condensers to the steam engines and they made their own distilled water and they ran it on that. And the engineer by then was John Sainer that built the bridges up in Northwich. And he reckoned it had extended the life of the lift by 10 years. But around about the turn of the century, the damage had already been done and it was broke more than it was open. So first off, they were going to build a new lift where Anderton Concrete is, get that up and running, and then we would fix this one, we would have had 2 lifts. Another idea was just to replace the rams. but that would have meant closing for a very long time. So John Sainer turned round to the trustees and said, well, I'm an electrical engineer, and I can convert this lift to electrical counterbalance operation for lot less money than building a new lift, and with only 6 weeks of closures. Once they heard this, they said, oh, please go on. So in March 1906, he closed for 19 days, and they put a coffer dam in, pumped the water out, concreted what was below us now is the dry well, and put the foundations in for these A-frames that you see on the side of us. And then he carried on using the lift while they started building this lift around his hydraulic lift. And then in August 1906, he closed for 10 days. They put the river gates on. They went to see a man in Manchester, not about a dog, but he'd got a little car company, a man called Henry Royce, and he built him a couple of pumps before he met Mr. Rolls. And they put these pumps in the bottom and pumped the water out, so we now have dry wells. And then for 2 years, John Sainer built his lift, which is what you see above you, over the top of the hydraulic lift. And when this was completed in 1908, he lowered the case onto the bottom and he cut the ram off, because he said that's the only thing that's failed. The rest of the cast iron's great. And he attached 18 steel wires to this caisson. It went up over the 450 tons of winding gear along the side, and these wires came down the side, and he attached 18 14-ton weights to them. 18 times 14 gives you that magic number, 252, which counterbalance the weight of the caisson. With a little 30 horsepower electric motor on the top, he then just used it to overcome friction, and the weights did most of the work, and he could operate the caisson up and down electrically. Now the counterbalance weights are still in the ground. We use them as a kiddie's maze, and it worked quite well. And if you count the times up that he closed it, he said he'd do it in 6 weeks. And he shut for 19 days, 10 days and 20, 49 days, 7 weeks. He'd overrun by 1 week. I think that's a pretty spectacular feat of engineering, to build this lift over the top of the other one. Health and safety must have gone out the window though. I don't think I'd like to have been in the lift while they were lifting all this gear above your head. But they did it, and they built it. And then once he'd got that, he did the same to the other side, which meant that they could lift 2 together when they were busy, or lower 2 together, or if one was out for repair, they just used the one side. And it worked well for many years. And when he retired in 1933, he said this was his baby. He said, there's 3 things you've got to do: oil it, grease it and paint it. Paint it was the big one, because the air was toxic. And then we had the Second World War. But after the Second World War, there was lots of people who came out of the army that had learned to drive. There was lots of army trucks for sale, cheaply. So people were buying them and started transporting goods on the road. So it meant that there was less traffic coming through the lift, less tolls being taken. 1963, or 62, 63, there was a big freeze from Boxing Day 62 up until the middle of March 63. All the canals froze solid. So anything that was being carried by waterway then went to road, and it never came back. So after 1963, the only goods coming through the lift then were pleasure boats. I think one year there was 39, so they weren't making any money at all whatsoever. Real shame. 1975, it was our 100th birthday. Blue Peter came down and did a TV programme about us. We've got a Blue Peter badge. If anyone finds it in the grounds, can you let us have it back, because we don't know where it is. But we're hoping in 18 months on our 150th anniversary that they'll come back and we'll get a gold one. This time it will go in the exhibition centre, and no one's going to lose it, I promise you. But we believe, because of this TV programme, English Heritage took notice, and they made it a listed structure, a national monument, in 1976, a year later, which meant British Waterways had to start spending money on it. I think they was a little bit upset about that, but they did start spending money on it. And in one of the scheduled maintenance in 1983, they scaffolded it out, and they sent painters up here on the top deck with chipping hammers to get rid of the old paint so they could repaint it. And they found out they didn't need chipping hammers. They could put their fingers through the 1-inch thick lead. It was so corroded, it was rotten. They tried to weld it up. Every time they put a welding rod on it, it blew a hole in it. It was making it worse. So they got the structural engineers down, and I read the report, and they didn't actually put it in the report, But we believe they used the word something like "oh dear me" in Old English, and they condemned it. They closed it down. So they had to lower the caissons, they pumped the water out, they took the counterbalance weights off, closed it down. They thought it was going to collapse. 1987, they took the 450 tons of winding gear off, put it in the ground because they didn't want that collapsing it. They thought they'd got away with it. But what they didn't realise, there was a couple that used to have a narrowboat up here, Christine and Ted Thompson. Now the gates are going up, we'll be out in a minute. And Christine and Ted Thompson were members of the Trent and Mersey Canal Society. And Christine turned around to Ted one day and said, "Ted, we can't let it go into rack and ruin. We've got to do something, haven't you?" As all wives say. And Ted went, "Of course I have, darling." And they set up the Friends of the Anderton Lift. If anyone's ever here at the weekend, Ted's still a volunteer. He's 87 and he comes in every weekend and he sits up in a coffee shop. So if you see a gentleman with a cane and one of these t-shirts on, go and have a chat to him. He'll tell you the whole story. He's a lovely bloke. So they set up the Friends of the Anderton Boat Lift. And anyone that walked past, they had a little caravan up here and they brought them in, explained to them how the boat lift operated, and got to sign a petition to save the lift. They raised 15,000 signatures. They got the local MP involved, a man of certain notoriety, Mr. Neil Hamilton, you may remember him. And they went down to Downing Street with him to present this petition to Margaret Thatcher. And they're having tea and cake with Margaret Thatcher, and she says, "You're doing a wonderful job, you have my full support. But the only thing you're getting from me is that tea and cake, I've got no money to give you." So they came back, they started raising money. They raised £500,000 of individual donations, a further £3.5 million of corporate donations. And with nearly £4 million in the bank, the English Heritage Lottery Fund rang them up and said, "We can contribute the maximum," and gave them a further 3.3. In year 2000, they started restoring the lift, but English Heritage said, because the structure's not strong enough to support everything, strengthen it up enough so that you can put the machine deck back on the top, so people can see how it looked for most of its working life, but you can convert it back to hydraulic operation, which we did. The rams a piece cost £1 million each 21 years ago, so they weren't cheap. 2002 we reopened. 2003, our king, he was a prince then, came and sat in this chair. He was sitting in a throne, madam. Came and sat in that chair. We took him through the lift down to Northwich, what we've done now, and he officially opened us. And that's pretty much the end of my story of the lift. It's not necessarily the correct version though. I do make things up. Now if anyone wants to, we do sell a little guidebook from the exhibition centre. And it's only £5 and all the money goes to keep operating the lift, and that's got the proper version in it. No, it's really good. It's quite an interesting little keepsake. But yeah, it's £5 a piece in the exhibition centre if anybody wants one. And this year they've given us this brand new digital, what we've nicknamed a begging machine. And if anybody wishes to make a donation to keeping the lift open, it'll be at the bottom of the stairs there. If you tap your card on here, it takes £3 off you. So for myself, Andrew, Kai and Paul, thank you for putting up with us, and I hope you've enjoyed that. Thank you very much.